Let's jump right into a terrifying reality of modern warfare. We're stepping into a world where entire cities can be pulverized, essential power grids frozen in a matter of seconds, and critical, life-saving networks just silently dismantled. And the most chilling part of all this, we're going to explore how these devastating actions are being justified under the exact same laws that were designed to protect humanity. Welcome to this explainer.
So we really have to ask ourselves a profound and honestly unsettling question. Can an atrocity be perfectly legal? How is it that military forces today can obliterate hospitals, block humanitarian convoys, or digitally freeze an entire society's infrastructure, yet confidently portray these actions not as war crimes, but as the unfortunate yet perfectly lawful outcomes of war?
Well, the answer lies in what the International Committee of the Red Cross describes as a newly forming alternative moral and ethical landscape. It's a space where the law is literally contorted to justify the very violence it was meant to prevent. Warring parties maintain this stance, this veneer of being law-abiding actors, all while unleashing an extraordinary degree of military force. It's a massive contradiction. We're witnessing the alarming rise of what military strategists actually call awful but lawful tactics. This paradox is pushing the equilibrium between military necessity and our common humanity to the absolute breaking point. Because think about it, if superpowers continuously stretch international law to sanction devastation, the law doesn't just bend, it risks losing its meaning entirely. To understand how we arrived at this highly dangerous modern precipice, we can't just look at the present. We have to step back into the unfathomable rubble of World War II. It was in the darkest hours of human history, right amidst the smoke of shattered cities and millions of graves, that the modern rules of war were forged out of absolute desperation. You see, the rules of war didn't just emerge overnight. It started with Henri Dunant's lone vision way back in 1864 to simply care for wounded soldiers on the battlefield. But it culminated in a desperate, deeply urgent diplomatic conference in 1949. 64 nations gathered in Geneva, and their urgency was born directly out of the ashes of Warsaw, the starvation of Leningrad, and the completely unimaginable horrors of a global total war. The sheer apocalyptic scale of World War II completely shattered the illusion that the existing laws were sufficient. War had fundamentally transformed. With the Allied firebombing of civilian centers, the atomic flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the horrifying Nazi genocide, combatants were deliberately targeting existence itself. War no longer merely threatened armies, it threatened the complete eradication of entire societies. In response to this total devastation, the delegates in 1949 achieved something genuinely remarkable. They systematically divided legal protections to counter the chaos. They categorized the battlefields of land, the perilous seas, the dark corners of captivity, and, most revolutionarily of all, everyday civilian life. Every single convention was a desperate attempt to place a legal shield over a specific vulnerability. And that brings us to the civilian imperative. Prior to 1949, treaty law gave far stronger attention to the soldiers fighting the war than to the civilians trapped in their crossfire. The Fourth Convention was a monumental historical innovation. It finally recognized that modern war harms far more than just soldiers on a battlefield. It literally crushes the people living in its path. So with the ink on the Fourth Convention, civilians officially ceased to be mere incidental casualties of war. They became legally protected persons. For the first time in human history, international law established a strict code of conduct for occupying armies. It explicitly outlawed murder, torture, collective punishment, and mass deportations. They essentially engineered a legal shield where there was once only absolute vulnerability.
Yet, as modern historians and legal scholars point out through frameworks like TWAL, we have to acknowledge a glaring omission here. While the 1949 framework fiercely protected European populations under foreign occupation, it largely turned a blind eye to colonial wars of independence. Despite the diverse nations present in Geneva, the laws quietly preserved certain imperial structures, which really reveals how geopolitics inevitably shapes even the most noble humanitarian law.
And even with the Fourth Convention protecting civilians from foreign occupiers, a massive bleeding gap remained. I mean, what happens when a country goes to war with itself? For internal conflicts and civil wars, the law was virtually silent. States fiercely guarded their sovereignty, and they were incredibly reluctant to let international law dictate how they handled their own internal rebellions. This crisis birthed one of the most vital legal achievements in history, Common Article 3. You can think of it as a mini-convention nested deep within the larger treaties. It acts as an absolute, unbreakable legal floor for non-international conflicts. It fundamentally rejects the extremely dangerous proposition that state sovereignty, military necessity, or bitter revenge can ever place a human being entirely outside international protection. The true brilliance of Common Article 3 lies in its sheer power of restraint. It doesn't legitimize rebel groups or grant combatants immunity. Instead, it forces a baseline of humanity onto the chaos. It demands that anyone no longer actively fighting, whether they're wounded, detained, or a civilian, must be treated humanely. This ensures that even a deeply fragmented civil war never descends into a total legal void. But now we must snap back from the ink and paper of 1949 to the chilling reality of the present day. Because right now, these very conventions face their most terrifying existential threat yet, the silent, invisible, and highly destructive realm of cyber warfare. We've moved from the smoking rubble of physical cities to the extremely vulnerable digital battlefields of the 21st century. The entire law of armed conflict, every single protection we've just discussed, hinges on one legal trigger: the definition of an attack. If an action isn't legally classified as an attack, the strict rules of targeting simply don't apply. But the 1949 definition relies heavily on one specific word: violence. And in our modern digital age, that single word sparks a massive, incredibly dangerous debate. Seriously? Is a cyber operation an attack if no one bleeds? Imagine if a military hacks into a civilian power grid, a water treatment plant, or a hospital network and simply turns it off. No bombs are dropped, no physical hardware is shattered, but an entire city is plunged into darkness and chaos. Does the Geneva Convention even apply to a digital freeze like that? This dilemma brilliantly illustrates a dangerous schism currently tearing through international law. Highly capable military states are deeply divided on this. Nations like Denmark and Israel take a restrictive view, insisting that an attack absolutely requires tangible physical damage or human injury. Meanwhile, countries like France and Costa Rica argue for an expansive view, warning that a loss of functionality, like digitally paralyzing a critical server, absolutely constitutes an act of war. Both interpretations carry massive, society-altering risks. If the world adopts the restrictive view, we leave mass civilian digital disruption totally unregulated. Hostile hackers could legally shut down a society's entire social services system. But if we take the expansive view, we potentially outlaw traditional, non-violent military tactics, like psychological operations that hijack a radio broadcast. We are basically trapped with no easy middle ground. And this tension escalates even further with a second, massive legal fracture. We have to ask a question that would have absolutely baffled the delegates back in 1949. Is digital data an object? The law strictly prohibits attacking civilian objects. But if an object has to be tangible to be protected, does our digital existence even count? Welcome to the data dilemma. The majority of legal experts currently argue that data is intangible and therefore legally unprotected. But a growing minority is warning of a catastrophic threat. Because if data isn't an object, modern armies could legally delete a nation's entire banking system, wipe out decades of tax records, or just erase public transit data. They could engineer devastating societal collapse without ever firing a single bullet. This digital gray zone takes us right back to the warning we started with. We are testing the absolute outer limit of acceptable behavior. As warfare evolves into cyberspace, the gap between agreed rules and the grim reality of destruction is widening. And it's leading to a silent, but undeniable, erosion of the humanitarian principles forged back in 1949. As the International Committee of the Red Cross warns, when legal loopholes are endlessly exploited, the Geneva Conventions cease to be a shield for the innocent and instead become a legal tool contorted to serve military might. If we spend all our time endlessly debating the dictionary definition of violence while civilian infrastructure is digitally paralyzed, we are effectively gutting the law of its soul just to justify 21st century devastation. To survive this volatile new era, the global community really has to restore the spirit of 1949. States have to stop treating the conventions as a checklist for finding loopholes. They need to lead by example, interpret the laws in good faith, and hold violators strictly accountable in domestic courts. Above all, they must recognize that all civilian life carries equal weight, whether the threat comes from a physical artillery shell or a malicious line of code. We want to leave you with this final thought. The laws of war were born from the ashes of physical destruction to protect our common humanity. As warfare inevitably evolves into silent, invisible networks, will humanity uphold the spirit of the law to adapt and save lives? Or will our legal protections simply fall silent in the digital age?